The grandfather clock in Oliver's foyer struck midnight as I stood frozen in the shadow of his mahogany staircase, my engagement ring catching what little moonlight filtered through the stained glass windows. The house felt different tonight, colder, more menacing than the warm sanctuary I'd known for the past 3 years. My bare feet were silent against the Persian rug as I crept closer to the study where voices drifted like poison through the crack beneath the door. "She's so naive, Oliver." Almost painfully so. His mother's voice was a serpent's whisper, dripping with a venom I'd never heard before. 3 more days and everything she's worked for becomes ours. My heart stopped beating. The world tilted on its axis. "I know, Mother. Sometimes I almost feel sorry for her." Oliver's laugh was hollow, foreign, nothing like the warm chuckle that had made me fall in love with him. "But $50 million and controlling shares in Dillon Industries? Sorry doesn't pay the bills." The engagement ring suddenly felt like a shackle around my finger. My knees buckled and I pressed my palm against the wall to keep from falling. This couldn't be real. This had to be some terrible nightmare. But the voices continued, each word a dagger to my heart. "The prenup she signed is worthless, of course. My lawyer made sure of that." His mother's satisfaction was palpable. "Once you're married, we can contest her father's will. With you as her husband, we have legal standing. The grief-stricken daughter who can't handle business decisions? Who needs her loving husband to take over. And if she fights us?" "Accidents happen, darling. Especially to young widows who can't handle the pressure." I bit down so hard on my knuckle that I tasted blood. They were planning my death. My own fiancé, the man I'd given 3 years of my life to, the man I was supposed to marry in 48 hours, was planning to eliminate me from my inheritance. The floorboard creaked beneath my weight and the voices went silent. My body moved on autopilot, muscle memory guiding me through the darkness toward the back door. I had to get out. I had to think. I had to survive. As I slipped into the night, one thought burned through my terror like a brand. They had no idea who they were dealing with. 48 hours earlier I was the happiest woman alive. My name is Janice Dillon, and at 28 I thought I had everything figured out. The Dillon name carried weight in Charleston. Old money, older reputation, and a business empire my great-grandfather had built from nothing. When my parents died in a car accident 2 years ago, I inherited everything. The house on Battery Street, the summer home in Kiowa, and controlling interest in Dillon Industries, a shipping and logistics company worth over $100 million. But more than the money, more than the power, I thought I had love. Oliver Aldridge was everything I'd dreamed of in a partner. 6'2" with dark hair that curled just enough to make him look approachable, green eyes that seemed to see straight into my soul, and a smile that made my knees weak even after 3 years together. He was a consultant. Smart, ambitious, and from a good family, though they'd fallen on harder times recently. His mother, Vivian Aldridge, had been nothing but warm and welcoming, treating me like the daughter she'd never had. "Janice, darling, you're going to make the most beautiful bride," she'd said just that morning, adjusting the pearl necklace at my throat. We were in my bedroom, the very room where I'd grown up, surrounded by wedding preparations. Silk and satin draped every surface, and the air smelled of gardenias, my chosen wedding flower. "I still can't believe it's really happening," I'd whispered, catching her eyes in the antique mirror. "Sometimes I wake up afraid it's all a dream." Vivian had squeezed my shoulders, her touch gentle but firm. "Believe it, sweetheart. Oliver loves you more than life itself. We both do." How perfectly she'd played her part. I spent that afternoon with my wedding planner, Caroline, going over last-minute details. The ceremony would be held in the garden of my family estate, among the ancient oak trees draped with Spanish moss. 300 guests would witness Oliver and me exchange vows beneath an arch of white roses and magnolia blossoms. The reception would flow seamlessly into the ballroom my great-grandmother had designed, where a 12-piece orchestra would play while we danced our first dance to "The Way You Look Tonight." "Everything's perfect," Caroline assured me, checking items off her color-coded clipboard. "The flowers arrived this morning, the caterers will be here at dawn, and the photographer will capture every magical moment." Perfect. That word felt like mockery now. That evening I'd driven to Oliver's house, the modest but elegant Victorian his family had owned for generations, with a bottle of champagne and dreams of our future dancing in my head. I'd used my key, the one he'd given me 6 months ago, with a kiss and a promise that his home was my home. If I'd knocked, if I'd announced myself, if I'd been anyone other than the trusting fool I was, everything might have been different. Instead, I'd slipped in quietly, planning to surprise him. The house was dark except for the light spilling from his study, and I'd moved toward it like a moth to flame, eager to share my excitement about our wedding day. The conversation I overheard changed everything. Before we continue with Isabella's shocking revelation, pause for a moment and write in the comments which country you're watching from. We love knowing where our global family of survivors and truth seekers is tuning in from. And if this is your first time discovering our channel, hit that subscribe button because your support helps us share more stories of women who trusted their instincts and turned betrayal into triumph. Remember, if something feels wrong, it probably is. Now let's see how Isabella's world crumbles and rebuilds. Enjoy. Standing outside Oliver's study that night, listening to them plan my destruction, I felt something die inside me. It wasn't just my heart breaking, though that was part of it. It was the death of innocence, of trust, of the woman I'd been just minutes before. The timing has to be perfect, Vivian was saying as I pressed my ear closer to the door. The wedding creates the legal framework we need, but we can't move too quickly. A month, maybe two, to establish the marriage. Then the accident. What kind of accident? Oliver's voice was clinical, detached, as if they were discussing the weather rather than murder. A fall, perhaps. The stairs in that old house are so treacherous. Or maybe something with her car. She drives too fast on those winding roads to Kiowa. Vivian paused, and I could imagine her tapping her manicured finger against her chin, the way she did when she was thinking. The important thing is that it looks natural. No suspicion, no investigation. And you're sure the will can be contested? Absolutely. Grief makes people vulnerable, Oliver. You'll be the devastated widower, too overcome to handle business decisions. I'll step in as the concerned mother-in-law, helping you through this difficult time. Between the two of us, we'll have control of everything within 6 months. My legs gave out and I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the cold marble floor. The voices continued, but they seemed to come from very far away, as if I were drowning and they were calling to me from the surface. They discussed details with the casualness of planning a dinner party. How they'd sell off parts of the company to pay Oliver's gambling debts. Debts I'd known nothing about. How they'd liquidate my art collection, my jewelry, everything my family had built over 4 generations. How they'd probably sell the house and move somewhere no one knew them, to start fresh with my money. What about her brother? Oliver asked. Daniel. My younger brother, 25 and fresh out of law school, working for a firm in Atlanta. He was supposed to be my best man. An unconventional choice that Oliver had initially resisted before relenting with that charming smile of his. He's young, idealistic, and lives 4 hours away. Vivian dismissed him with a wave I could hear in her voice. Besides, the will leaves everything to Janice, not him. Once she's gone, he has no legal claim to anything. They were wrong about that, but I wasn't about to correct them. I almost feel bad about Daniel, Oliver mused. He actually likes me. Looks up to me like a big brother. Sentiment is a luxury we can't afford, his mother replied sharply. You've been playing this part for 3 years, Oliver. Don't go soft on me now. 3 years. Our entire relationship had been a lie. I thought about our first meeting at a charity gala, how he'd rescued me from a boring conversation with Charleston's most persistent bachelor. How he'd made me laugh, made me feel seen in a way I never had before. Our first kiss in the moonlight at White Point Garden, the taste of champagne on his lips. The way he'd held me when I cried over my parents' death anniversary, whispering words of comfort that had seemed to come from his soul. All of it. Every moment, every kiss, every whispered, "I love you," had been carefully calculated, perfectly performed. She's so trusting, Vivian continued, and her tone was almost fond. Like a lamb walking into a slaughterhouse. Even signed that prenup without having her own lawyer look at it. The prenup. Oliver had presented it as a formality, something his family's lawyer had insisted on. Just to protect both of us, he'd said with an apologetic smile. I know it seems unromantic, but it'll make things simpler. I'd signed it without question, touched that he wanted to protect me from gold diggers who might try to come after my fortune if something happened to our marriage. I was such a fool. Are you sure she doesn't suspect anything? Oliver asked. Please. The girl thinks you hung the moon. She's been planning your future together since the second date. Mrs. Oliver Aldridge, living happily ever after in her fairy tale life. Vivian's laugh was like breaking glass. She even asked me to help her plan your 5-year anniversary celebration. 5 years. As if she'll live to see it. The casual cruelty of that statement hit me like a physical blow. I doubled over, pressing my face against my knees to muffle the sob that threatened to escape. They were talking about me like I was already dead, like I was nothing more than an obstacle between them and my inheritance. But as I sat there on the cold floor, something unexpected happened. The crushing despair began to transform into something else, something harder and sharper. Bigger. Rage. A fury so pure and hot that it burned away the tears on my cheeks. They thought I was weak. They thought I was stupid. They thought I would go quietly into whatever grave they had planned for me. They were about to learn how wrong they were. I stayed there for another 20 minutes, listening to them refine their plan, memorizing every detail. They discussed the life insurance policy Oliver would take out on me after the wedding. Just standard coverage for a young married couple, he'd say. They talked about which assets to liquidate first, how to explain my accidental death to my friends and business associates, even how long Oliver should wait before moving on with his life. By the time I crept out of that house and into the darkness of the Charleston night, I was no longer Janice Dillon, the naive bride-to-be. I was someone else entirely, someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous than they could imagine. I drove home through empty streets, my mind racing with possibilities. The smart thing would be to cancel the wedding, expose them, and let the law handle things. But as I pulled into my driveway and looked up at the house where 7 generations of Dillons had lived and died, I knew that wouldn't be enough. They wanted to destroy me. They wanted to steal everything my family had built. Fine. But they'd chosen the wrong victim, and they were about to learn that Janice Dillon wasn't going down without a fight. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Vivian's voice discussing my death like a business transaction, or Oliver's laugh as he admitted he'd been lying to me for 3 years. Instead, I sat in my father's study, surrounded by portraits of Dillon ancestors who'd built empires and survived wars, and I planned. At 6 in the morning I called Daniel. Jan? Jesus, what time is it? My brother's voice was thick with sleep and confusion. Aren't you getting married tomorrow? Shouldn't you be getting beauty rest or something? Daniel, I need you to come home. No. Today. And I need you to not ask questions until you get here. Something in my voice must have convinced him, because the sleep cleared from his tone immediately. What's wrong? I can't explain over the phone. Just trust me. This is life or death, Danny. Literally. There was a long pause. Daniel and I had always been close, closer than most siblings, maybe because we'd had to lean on each other after our parents died. He knew I didn't exaggerate, didn't call for help unless I truly needed it. I'll be there by noon, he said finally. Janice, whatever's happening, we'll fix it. You know that, right? For the first time in 12 hours, I smiled. I know. The next 6 hours crawled by like years. I went through the motions of wedding preparation, accepting calls from vendors and well-wishers, nodding along as Caroline fussed over last-minute details. Oliver called twice, his voice warm and excited, asking if I was ready to become Mrs. Aldridge. Both times I managed to sound appropriately bridal, when what I really wanted was to reach through the phone and strangle him. I can't wait to start our life together, baby, he said during the second call. Tomorrow's going to be perfect. Yes, I agreed, staring at my reflection in the bedroom mirror. The woman looking back at me had the same face, the same dark hair and blue eyes, but something fundamental had changed. There was a hardness there now, a calculation that hadn't existed 24 hours ago. It certainly will be. Daniel arrived at 12:03 p.m., bursting through the front door like he used to when we were kids. At 25 he still had some of that boyish energy, but his years at law school had sharpened him, given him an edge that served him well in court. Today that edge would serve us both. Okay, I'm here, he announced, finding me in the kitchen where I'd been pretending to eat lunch. What's the emergency that couldn't wait until after your wedding? I looked at my little brother, 6'1" and broader than me, but still my baby brother, and felt a wave of protective fury wash over me. They'd planned to use him too, to manipulate his grief after my death to gain access to what little the will left him. Sit down, I said quietly, and prepare yourself for the worst thing you've ever heard. I told him everything. Every word I'd overheard, every detail of their plan, every casual cruelty they discussed. Daniel's face went through a spectrum of emotions: disbelief, horror, rage, and finally cold determination that matched my own. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up and started pacing, his hands clenched into fists. "We're calling the police," he said finally. "We're calling them right now, and we're having both of those psychopaths arrested." "For what? Conspiracy to commit murder?" "Based on a conversation I overheard while illegally in Oliver's house." I shook my head. "It would be their word against mine, and they're very good liars, Danny. They've been lying to me for 3 years. Then we cancel the wedding. We expose them publicly. And they disappear. Vanish with whatever they can grab and spend the rest of their lives plotting another way to get what they think they're owed." I leaned forward, meeting his eyes. "That's not justice, Daniel. That's just postponing the inevitable." He stopped pacing and looked at me with growing understanding. "What are you thinking, Jan?" "I'm thinking they want to play games with a Dylan. I'm thinking they have no idea what that means." I stood up, feeling more like myself than I had since the night before. "I'm thinking it's time to show them." Over the next 4 hours we planned. Daniel's legal training was invaluable. He knew exactly what evidence we'd need, what laws they were breaking, and how to ensure that when we struck, it would be devastatingly effective. But it was my knowledge of Charleston society, of the intricate web of relationships and obligations that bound the old families together, that would make our revenge truly perfect. "The wedding's still happening," I announced as we finalized our strategy. "Janice, no. You can't marry him. Even for revenge you can't." "I'm not marrying him," I interrupted. "Trust me on this one, little brother. By tomorrow evening, Oliver Aldridge is going to wish he'd never heard the name Dylan." That night I performed the role of excited bride one last time. I had dinner with Oliver and Vivian at the country club, accepting their toasts to my happiness and their promises of eternal love. I smiled when Vivian presented me with her grandmother's pearl bracelet, something old for the bride, and kissed Oliver when he whispered that he couldn't wait to call me his wife. "Tomorrow's going to be a day we'll never forget," I told them both, raising my glass of champagne. They had no idea how right I was. I woke up at dawn on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. The morning was perfect. Clear skies, gentle breeze, the kind of Charleston spring day that belonged on postcards. Through my bedroom window, I could see the army of workers transforming our garden into a wedding venue. White silk draped the ancient oak trees, thousands of white roses created an altar fit for a fairy tale, and a string quartet was already setting up beneath the gazebo where my grandparents had been married 60 years ago. It would have been beautiful if it weren't all a lie. Caroline arrived at 8, bringing my hair and makeup team with her. As they worked on transforming me into the perfect bride, I caught glimpses of myself in the mirror. The face looking back at me was serene, radiant, exactly what everyone expected to see. But behind my eyes I was someone else entirely. "You're absolutely glowing," Caroline gushed as she arranged my veil. "I've never seen a bride look more beautiful." If only she knew what I was really glowing with. It wasn't happiness or love. It was the pure, clean energy of anticipated revenge. My dress was a masterpiece. A custom Vera Wang creation that had taken 8 months to complete. Ivory silk that seemed to flow like water, hand-sewn pearls that caught the light with every movement, and a train that would photograph beautifully as I walked down the aisle. The dress of a woman who was supposed to live happily ever after, not one who was planning the destruction of her groom. Daniel arrived at 10, looking handsome in his morning coat but with eyes that reflected my own steely determination. He kissed my cheek and squeezed my hand. "You ready for this?" he whispered. "I've been ready my whole life," I whispered back. The guests began arriving at 11 for the noon ceremony. Charleston's elite turned out in force. Politicians, business leaders, old families whose names appeared on street signs and buildings throughout the city. They came expecting to witness a fairy tale romance, the union of 2 prominent Southern families. Instead, they were about to see something much more memorable. I watched from my bedroom window as Oliver greeted guests, playing the role of nervous but excited groom to perfection. He looked handsome in his formal attire, his smile warm and genuine seeming as he shook hands and accepted congratulations. Vivian was in her element, dressed in pale blue silk and holding court among the other mothers, no doubt accepting compliments on her son's excellent choice in brides. At 11:45, Caroline knocked on my door. "It's time, Janice. Are you ready?" I took one last look at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me was a bride, but she was also something else. Something harder and more dangerous than anyone suspected. "I'm ready," I said. The music began as I stepped onto the terrace. 300 guests rose to their feet, their faces turned toward me with expressions of delight and admiration. The string quartet played Pachelbel's canon as I began my walk down the rose-petal-strewn aisle, my arm linked through Daniel's. But as we walked, I noticed something the guests couldn't see from their angle. Instead of the traditional white roses and baby's breath, the bouquet in my hands was made of black roses, a detail I'd insisted on to my florist's horror, claiming it was an artistic choice, a bold statement. The black silk ribbon around the stems fluttered in the breeze like a warning flag. Oliver stood at the altar, his face radiant with what looked like genuine joy. For a moment, seeing him there in his formal attire surrounded by all the beauty and tradition of a Southern wedding, I almost forgot what I'd learned 2 nights ago. Almost remembered what it felt like to love him. Then I saw Vivian in the front row, her smile triumphant and predatory, and the spell broke. I reached the altar and Daniel placed my hand in Oliver's, just as tradition demanded. Oliver's fingers were warm and steady, and when he looked into my eyes, I saw what looked like real emotion there. "You're so beautiful," he whispered, just loud enough for the front rows to hear. The perfect groom's words. "Thank you," I whispered back, my voice carrying clearly in the hushed garden. "You look perfect too. Absolutely perfect for what's about to happen." Something flickered in his eyes, confusion, maybe a hint of unease. But the music was ending and the officiant was beginning to speak, and there was no time for questions. The ceremony proceeded exactly as rehearsed. We exchanged rings, his a simple gold band, mine the 3-carat diamond solitaire he'd presented with such apparent love 8 months ago. The officiant spoke about love and commitment, about the bonds that tie 2 souls together for eternity. If he only knew how prophetic those words would prove to be. "Do you, Oliver James Aldridge, take Janice Rose Dillon to be your lawfully wedded wife? Do you promise to love, honor and cherish her in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part?" "I do," Oliver said, his voice strong and clear, carrying across the garden to where 300 guests waited with bated breath. The officiant turned to me. "Do you, Janice Rose Dillon, take Oliver James Aldridge to be your lawfully wedded husband? Do you promise to love, honor and cherish him in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part?" I looked into Oliver's eyes, seeing expectation and triumph there. Behind him I could see Vivian leaning forward slightly, her face bright with anticipation. In a few minutes they thought I would legally be family. Their plan could move forward. "No," I said clearly, my voice carrying across the suddenly silent garden. "I don't." The collective gasp from the guests sounded like wind through the trees. Oliver's face went white, then red, then white again. "Janice," he whispered, confusion and growing panic in his voice. "What are you doing?" I stepped back, creating distance between us, and raised my voice so everyone could hear me clearly. "I'm saving my life," I announced. "Because 2 nights ago, I learned that my beloved fiancé and his charming mother have been planning to murder me for my inheritance." The garden erupted in chaos. Guests rose from their seats, voices raised in shock and disbelief. I saw phones coming out, cameras turning toward us. By tomorrow this would be front-page news in Charleston and beyond. "Janice, you're being hysterical," Vivian called out, standing up from her seat in the front row. Her voice was smooth, concerned, the perfect mother-in-law trying to manage a bride's nerves. "Wedding jitters are perfectly normal, dear. Perhaps we should listen to the recording I made," I interrupted, pulling my phone from where I'd hidden it in my bouquet. "The one where you and your son discuss the best way to stage my accident after the wedding." Oliver lunged toward me, but Daniel was already moving, stepping between us with the protective instincts of a younger brother who'd just learned someone wanted to hurt his sister. "Don't," Daniel said quietly, his hand on Oliver's chest. "Don't make this worse than it already is." "Janice, stop this," Oliver pleaded, his mask finally slipping to reveal the desperation underneath. "You don't understand what you heard. It wasn't what you think." "It wasn't what I think?" I laughed, and the sound was bitter as winter wind. "Let me refresh your memory, darling." I pressed play on the recording Daniel had helped me make the night before. In the sudden quiet of the garden, every word was crystal clear. "She's so naive, Oliver. Almost painfully so. 3 more days and everything she's worked for becomes ours. I know, Mother. Sometimes I almost feel sorry for her. But $50 million and controlling shares in Dillon Industries? Sorry doesn't pay the bills. The voices of Oliver and Vivian discussing my murder filled the garden like poison gas. Guests who'd been murmuring in confusion fell silent, their faces reflecting growing horror as the conversation continued. The prenup she signed is worthless, of course. My lawyer made sure of that. Once you're married, we can contest her father's will. And if she fights us? Accidents happen, darling. Especially to young widows who can't handle the pressure. By the time the recording ended, the garden was silent except for the sound of sirens growing closer. Daniel had made some calls that morning and Charleston's finest were right on time. Oliver and Vivian stood frozen, their faces masks of shock and growing panic. Around them, 300 of Charleston's most prominent citizens stared in horrified fascination. You recorded us illegally, Vivian said finally, her voice shaking but still trying to maintain some semblance of control. That's not admissible in court. It's entrapment. You're right about one thing, I agreed, smoothing down my wedding dress as police officers began moving through the crowd. That recording was made illegally. But this one wasn't. I pulled out a second phone and Daniel stepped forward with papers in his hand. Last night Janice and I obtained a court order for a controlled recording, he announced, his lawyer voice carrying clearly. This morning, before the ceremony, she called Oliver to confirm final details about their honeymoon. Oliver, being the considerate groom, called his mother to share the conversation. Daniel pressed play on the second recording. This one was from that morning, Oliver and Vivian discussing their timeline for my accident during our planned honeymoon in Italy. How the winding mountain roads would provide the perfect opportunity, how my death in a foreign country would complicate any investigation. That recording, Daniel continued, is completely admissible. As are the financial records we pulled showing Oliver's gambling debts, the fake prenup his mother's lawyer prepared, and the life insurance applications he planned to file next week. The police had reached the altar now. Detective Carter, who'd worked my parents' accident case, looked grim as he approached Oliver and Vivian. Oliver Aldridge, Vivian Aldridge, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and attempted theft. You have the right to remain silent. As the handcuffs clicked into place, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years. Complete and utter satisfaction. Oliver looked at me with eyes full of hatred and defeat. You think you've won, he snarled as Detective Carter led him away. You think you're so smart. But you loved me, Janice. For 3 years you loved me completely. That wasn't fake. That was real, and now you'll never have it again. I watched him being loaded into the police car, this man who'd held my heart and planned my death, and I smiled. You're absolutely right, Oliver. I'll never love like that again. I stepped closer to the car, my wedding dress rustling in the afternoon breeze. Because now I'm smart enough to know the difference between love and lies. And now everyone else knows it too. As the police cars pulled away, I turned to face the crowd of guests who were still staring in shocked silence. 300 of Charleston's elite, armed with phones and social media accounts, who just witnessed the scandal of the century. Family, friends, today was meant to be a celebration of love. Instead, it's a revelation of betrayal. What you just witnessed wasn't a wedding. It was the truth finally tearing off its mask. The crowd began to applaud, slowly at first, then building to a crescendo that echoed off the walls of my family home. Someone called out, "Good for you, Janice," and others took up the cry. Daniel appeared at my side, grinning broadly. So, he said, offering me his arm. What do you want to do with 300 guests and enough food for a small army? I looked around at the garden that had been transformed into a wedding venue, at the faces of friends and neighbors who'd come expecting to see me marry the man I loved, and I made a decision that felt exactly right. We're going to have a party, I announced. A celebration of justice, family, and the fact that sometimes the good guys actually win. And that's exactly what we did. The party that followed was unlike anything Charleston had ever seen. What began as a wedding reception became a celebration of survival, of family loyalty, and of the peculiar kind of justice that can only be served with true Southern style. We had what Daniel dubbed a justice cake. The same 3-tiered creation I'd ordered, but with new significance. The string quartet played on, though their selections shifted from wedding classics to something more triumphant. The photographer captured every moment, creating what would become the most unusual wedding album in Charleston history. Judge Harrison, a friend of my father's, stood up during what would have been the toasts. "I've been practicing law for 40 years, he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the reception. "And I've never seen a more elegant takedown of two criminals. Janice, your father would be proud." The sentiment was echoed by dozens of others throughout the evening. My father's business associates, my mother's charity committee friends, neighbors who'd watched me grow up. All of them understood that this wasn't just about stopping a murder plot. This was about protecting the legacy my family had built, about ensuring that predators who targeted grieving heiresses would face consequences. But it was my grandmother's best friend, Mrs. Charleston herself, Eugenie Rutledge, who said it best. "Darling, you didn't just dodge a bullet today. You turned that bullet around and sent it right back where it came from." As the sun set over Charleston Harbor and my guests finally began to leave, I found myself standing in the garden where I'd planned to pledge my life to a man who'd wanted to end it. The cleanup crew was already at work, dismantling the altar where I'd exposed Oliver and Vivian, packing away the flowers that had witnessed their downfall. Daniel appeared beside me, still in his morning coat but with his tie loosened and his hair mussed from dancing with half the unmarried women in Charleston. "So," he said, settling onto the stone bench where we'd sat as children. "How does it feel?" "Which part?" I asked, sinking down beside him. "The part where I found out the man I loved was planning to kill me, or the part where I turned my wedding into a public execution?" "The part where you won." I considered that, looking out over the harbor where ships had been bringing Dillon cargo for over a century. "It feels empty in a way. For 3 years my whole life revolved around Oliver, around our future together. Now what?" "Now you live," Daniel said simply. "Really live for the first time since Mom and Dad died. You're free, January, free of him, free of the lies, free of the fear you didn't even know you were carrying." He was right. Sitting there in my wedding dress that had become something else entirely, I felt lighter than I had in months. Maybe years. "What happens now?" I asked. "With the case, I mean." Daniel's expression turned serious. "Carter says it's airtight. The recordings, the financial evidence, the fake prenup. They're looking at 25 to life for conspiracy to commit murder, plus additional charges for fraud and attempted theft. Vivian's lawyer friend is cooperating, hoping for a reduced sentence. And Oliver's gambling debts? Worse than we thought. He owes over $2 million to some very unpleasant people. That's probably what pushed them to accelerate their timeline." Daniel shook his head. "If you'd married him, Janice, you would have been dead within a month." They were desperate. The weight of how close I'd come to destruction settled over me like a blanket. If I hadn't decided to surprise Oliver that night, if I'd knocked instead of using my key, if I'd been less curious about the voices in his study. "Hey," Daniel said, reading my thoughts the way he always could. "Don't do that. Don't think about the whats. You're here, you're safe, and those bastards are going to prison for a very long time." "I know. It's just, how did I miss it, Danny? How was I so blind for so long?" My brother was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Because you loved him. Really loved him with the kind of trust that doesn't question or doubt. That's not a weakness, January. That's actually a strength, even if it made you vulnerable. It almost got me killed. But it didn't. And now you know what real betrayal looks like. You'll never be fooled again." He stood up, brushing off his formal wear. "Come on. Let's get you out of that dress and into something more comfortable. Tomorrow we start the rest of your life." 6 months later, I stood in the Charleston County Courthouse wearing a black suit that had cost half as much as my wedding dress but felt 1,000 times more powerful. Today was sentencing day, and I'd been waiting for this moment since that terrible night when I'd learned the truth about the man I'd planned to marry. Oliver looked different in his orange jumpsuit. Smaller, somehow diminished. The confident charm that had fooled me for 3 years was gone, replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of a man who'd gambled everything and lost. Vivian sat beside him at the defendant's table, her perfectly coiffed hair and designer clothes a stark contrast to the handcuffs around her wrists. The courtroom was packed. Charleston society had turned out in force, drawn by a scandal that had dominated local headlines for months. The story had even made national news. The heiress who'd turned her wedding into a sting operation, the groom who'd planned to kill his bride for her inheritance, the mother who'd masterminded it all. District Attorney Rebecca Roman stood to address the court, her voice clear and unwavering. "Your Honor, The defendants orchestrated one of the most cold-blooded murder conspiracies this court has ever seen. For 3 years, Oliver Aldridge courted Janice Dillon with the sole intention of marrying her and then killing her for her inheritance. His mother, Vivian Aldridge, not only encouraged this plan but actively participated in its development. She detailed the evidence methodically: the fake prenup designed to circumvent my father's will, the life insurance policies Oliver had planned to take out, the timeline they'd developed for my accident during our honeymoon in Italy. Each revelation sent murmurs through the packed courtroom. But perhaps most chilling, D.A. Roman continued, is the casual nature of their planning. These defendants didn't see Janice Dillon as a human being. They saw her as an obstacle to overcome, a problem to solve. They discussed her murder with the same detachment most people would use to plan a grocery list. When it was time for victim impact statements, Daniel spoke first. His words were measured, professional, but the emotion underneath was unmistakable. Janice Dillon is not just my sister, he said, looking directly at Oliver and Vivian. She's one of the strongest, most compassionate people I know. When our parents died, she could have retreated from the world. Instead, she threw herself into preserving their legacy, growing the business they'd built, supporting the charities they'd cared about. She deserved love, not betrayal. She deserved protection, not predation. Then it was my turn. I walked to the podium slowly, feeling the weight of 300 eyes on me. 6 months ago, I'd been a naive woman planning her perfect wedding. Now I was someone else entirely, harder, wiser, but not broken. Never broken. Your Honor, I began, my voice steady and clear. Oliver Aldridge stole 3 years of my life. Not just the time we spent together, but the trust I'll never be able to give so freely again. He stole my ability to believe in fairy tale endings, to take love at face value, to sleep soundly without wondering what threats might be lurking in the darkness. I turned to look at Oliver directly. He met my eyes for a moment, then looked away. But he also gave me something unexpected, I continued. He showed me that I'm stronger than I ever imagined. Strong enough to trust my instincts when something felt wrong. Strong enough to gather evidence instead of falling apart. Strong enough to turn my wedding day into his reckoning. The courtroom was silent as I spoke about the fear I'd lived with. Not just the fear of dying, but the fear that I'd never be able to trust my own judgment again. About the nightmares that had plagued me for months, dreams where I hadn't overheard their conversation, where I'd walked down that aisle and signed my own death warrant. Oliver, you thought you were marrying a weak, trusting girl who would be easy to manipulate and eliminate, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. Instead, you found out what it really means to cross a Dillon. We don't just survive, we make sure our enemies never threaten anyone else again. When I finished, the courtroom was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning humming. Judge Patricia Holbrook, a stern woman in her 60s who'd been on the bench for over 20 years, looked down at the defendants with obvious disgust. Mr. Aldridge, Mrs. Aldridge, she said, her voice carrying the authority of decades in the courtroom. In 30 years of practicing and presiding over criminal law, I have rarely encountered defendants whose actions were so coldly calculated, so utterly devoid of human decency. She detailed their crimes methodically, her words falling like hammer blows. Conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree. Fraud. Attempted theft. Each charge carried its own weight, its own consequence. The evidence shows that this was not a crime of passion or desperation, but a carefully planned execution of an innocent woman whose only crime was loving the wrong person. Judge Holbrook's eyes moved between Oliver and Vivian. You preyed upon a woman who had already suffered the loss of her parents, who was vulnerable in her grief and trusting in her nature. Oliver's lawyer had tried to argue for leniency, claiming his client had been manipulated by his mother's influence. Vivian's attorney had painted her as a desperate woman trying to save her son from financial ruin. Neither argument had gained traction with the judge or jury. Oliver James Aldridge, Judge Holbrook announced, I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole for conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, plus 15 years for fraud and attempted theft, sentences to run concurrently. Oliver sagged in his chair, the reality of spending the rest of his life behind bars hitting him like a physical blow. His mother remained rigid, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. Vivian Marie Aldridge, as the mastermind behind this conspiracy, I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole for conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, plus 20 years for fraud and attempted theft, sentences to run concurrently. The courtroom erupted in murmurs of satisfaction. Justice had been served and everyone knew it. But Judge Holbrook wasn't finished. "I want to address something that has been troubling me throughout this case," she continued, her voice cutting through the noise. "The defendants seem to believe that their desperate financial circumstances somehow justified their actions. Let me be absolutely clear. Poverty does not excuse attempted murder. Desperation does not justify destroying an innocent life." She looked directly at Oliver and Vivian. "You had choices. You could have declared bankruptcy. You could have sought help from legitimate sources. You could have accepted the consequences of your poor financial decisions. Instead, you chose to target a woman whose only crime was falling in love with a liar." As the defendants were led away in shackles, Oliver turned to look at me one last time. His eyes held no remorse, no regret, only the cold hatred of a predator whose prey had escaped. "This isn't over, Janice," he called out as the bailiff pulled him toward the door. "You think you've won, but—" "Mr. Aldridge," Judge Holbrook interrupted sharply. "You have been sentenced to life without parole. As far as Miss Dillon is concerned, this is very much over." The door closed behind them with a final, satisfying click. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around me like bees. Questions flew from every direction. How had I known to investigate? What was it like to discover my fiancé's betrayal? How did it feel to see justice served? I answered them calmly, my media training from years of representing Dillon Industries serving me well. But the question that stayed with me came from a young woman journalist who pushed through the crowd as I was leaving. "Miss Dillon," she called out, "what would you say to other women who might be in similar situations? Women who suspect something is wrong but are afraid to investigate." I stopped walking and turned to face her, considering the question seriously. Around us, cameras clicked and rolled, capturing what would become one of the most quoted responses of the entire case. "Trust your instincts," I said finally. "If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't let love blind you to red flags. Don't let fear of being alone keep you in a dangerous situation." I paused, thinking of the woman I'd been 6 months ago. Trusting, naive, so desperate to believe in her fairy tale ending that she'd ignored every warning sign. "And if you do find yourself in danger," I continued, "remember that you're stronger than you think. Stronger than the people who want to hurt you believe. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just surviving, it's making sure everyone knows exactly who your enemies really are." 1 year after the trial, I stood in the boardroom of Dillon Industries, looking out over Charleston Harbor as my great-grandfather had done when he'd first built this company. The view was the same, but everything else had changed, including me. The past 12 months had been a whirlwind of growth, both personal and professional. Without the distraction of Oliver's lies and manipulation, I'd thrown myself into the family business with a focus and determination that surprised even me. Dillon Industries had expanded into 3 new markets, acquired 2 competitors and posted record profits for the year. "The Maritime Commission has approved our bid for the Port Authority contract," my CFO, Janet, announced, setting down a stack of papers on the polished mahogany table. "Congratulations, Janice. This makes us the largest shipping operation on the eastern seaboard." The dozen executives around the table applauded, and I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with money or power and everything to do with honoring my family's legacy. My parents would have been proud. My great-grandfather, who'd started this company with a single cargo ship and unlimited ambition, would have been over the moon. "Thank you all," I said, raising my coffee cup in a mock toast. "Here's to the Dillon name continuing to mean something in this city for another 100 years. After the meeting, I walked through the offices, greeting employees who'd become more like family over the past year. These people had watched me grow from a grieving daughter trying to fill her father's shoes into a confident leader who'd expanded their company and their job security. More than that, they'd been there during the scandal, offering support and loyalty when the media circus threatened to overshadow everything else. Miss Dillon, my assistant, Sarah, appeared at my elbow with her ever-present tablet. "You have a call on line 1. It's Detective Carter." I raised an eyebrow. Oliver and Vivian had been in prison for 6 months. What could the detective want now? "Janice," Detective Carter's familiar voice came through the speaker when I answered. "I wanted to give you a heads up about something before you see it on the news." My stomach tightened. "What now?" Oliver Aldridge was found dead in his cell this morning. The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I felt no grief for the man who'd planned my murder. How? Suicide. Apparently he'd been struggling with prison life more than most. His cellmate said he'd been talking about you, about how you'd destroyed his life, about how he should have killed you when he had the chance. I sank into my desk chair processing this information. And Vivian? Still alive, still proclaiming her innocence to anyone who'll listen. She's filed an appeal, but her lawyer doesn't think it'll go anywhere. Detective Carter paused. Janice, I want you to know, this doesn't change anything. Justice was served. Oliver's death doesn't diminish what he did to you or what he planned to do. I know, I said, and I did. I felt no satisfaction in Oliver's death, but no grief either. He'd made his choices and now he'd made his final one. Thank you for telling me personally, Detective. There's something else. We found letters in his cell, Janice. Letters he'd written to you but never sent. They're disturbing. Violent fantasies, detailed plans for what he would have done if he'd gotten out of prison. Carter's voice was gentle but serious. I wanted you to know, in case you see any copycat threats or if anyone contacts you claiming to be carrying out his wishes. The chill that ran down my spine had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Even in death, Oliver was trying to terrorize me. I'll be careful, I promised. And Detective, thank you for everything you did during the investigation, for taking my case seriously when it could have been dismissed as pre-wedding jitters. Just doing my job, ma'am. You take care of yourself. After I hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, watching ships navigate the harbor and thinking about the strange turns life could take. A year ago, I'd been planning my wedding to a man who'd wanted to kill me. Now he was dead, his mother was in prison for life, and I was running a multi-million-dollar company with more confidence and success than I'd ever imagined. The intercom buzzed. Miss Dillon? Your brother is here to see you. Daniel walked in a moment later, his face grave. He'd obviously heard the news. You okay? He asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. I think so. It's weird, I should feel something, right? Relief, satisfaction, something. But I just feel empty. That's normal, Daniel said. He can't hurt you anymore, but his death doesn't undo what he did. It doesn't give you back those 3 years or erase the betrayal. The detective said he left letters. Threatening me, planning what he'd do if he got out. I shook my head. Even dead, he's still trying to control me through fear. But he can't, Daniel said firmly. He's gone, January, really, truly gone. Whatever poison he carried, whatever hate he held on to, it died with him. I nodded, knowing my brother was right but still feeling unsettled. I keep thinking about what Mrs. Rutledge said at the trial. That I didn't just dodge a bullet, I turned it around and sent it back where it came from. And maybe the bullet finally found its target. Daniel was quiet for a moment, then leaned forward. Janice, look at me. What happened to Oliver in prison isn't your fault. You didn't kill him, his own guilt and cowardice did. You exposed him, you saw justice done, and then you moved on with your life. That's exactly what you were supposed to do. He was right, of course. But sitting there in my father's office, wearing the mantle of responsibility that came with the Dillon name, I couldn't shake the feeling that this story was finally, truly over. What now? I asked, echoing the same question I'd posed the night of my unwedding. How you keep living, Daniel said, smiling. Really living. You've proven you can survive betrayal, handle a crisis, and run a business. What else do you want to prove? I thought about that as I looked around the office that had become my sanctuary. The walls were lined with portraits of Dillon ancestors, men and women who'd built something lasting despite wars, economic crashes, and personal tragedies. They'd all faced their own betrayals, their own challenges, their own moments when they had to choose between giving up and fighting back. They'd all chosen to fight. I want to prove that the Dillon name means something beyond just business success, I said finally. I want to create a foundation, something that helps other women who've been targeted by predators. Legal aid, investigative resources, safe housing, whatever they need to fight back. Daniel's smile widened. The Janice Dillon Foundation for Survivor Justice? Something like that. I stood up, feeling energized for the first time since Detective Carter's call. Oliver wanted to destroy everything my family built. Instead, he's going to be the inspiration for something that could help hundreds of women. Now that, Daniel said, standing as well, is the kind of revenge that keeps on giving. That evening I drove out to Magnolia Cemetery, where my parents were buried beneath an ancient oak tree overlooking the Ashley River. I hadn't been there since the anniversary of their death 6 months ago, hadn't felt ready to face their graves with everything that had happened. Now, kneeling between their headstones with the sunset painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in over a year. "I'm okay," I whispered, placing white roses on each grave. "I know you were worried. I could feel it sometimes, like you were trying to warn me. But I figured it out and I'm okay." The wind rustled through the oak leaves above me, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I felt my mother's hand on my shoulder, my father's proud smile warming my back. "Oliver is gone," I continued, my voice stronger now. "He can't hurt me or anyone else ever again. And Vivian will die in prison, which is exactly what she deserves." I paused, thinking of the foundation I wanted to create, the legacy I wanted to build. "I'm going to do something good with this, something that would make you proud. I'm going to make sure other women don't go through what I did." As I drove home through Charleston's historic streets, past the houses where generations of my family had lived and loved and struggled, I realized something profound. I was no longer the woman who'd been betrayed and nearly murdered. I wasn't even the woman who'd turned her wedding into a courtroom drama. I was Janice Dillon, daughter of Charleston, survivor of betrayal and architect of justice. I was exactly who I was supposed to be. The story that had begun with such darkness, with whispered murder plots and calculated lies, was ending in light. Not the false brightness of a fairy tale ending, but the steady warm glow of a woman who'd been tested by fire and emerged stronger than ever. Oliver had wanted to destroy me, but instead he'd forged me into something unbreakable. And that, I thought as I pulled into the driveway of the house where 7 generations of Dillons had faced their own trials, was the sweetest revenge of all.